I wanted us to start today. My presentation is entitled Purity Culture and the Presence of God. And I recognize that this topic might hit close to home for some of us. And so I am wanting us just to take a moment to check in with ourselves. I invite everyone take a couple of deep breaths and maybe think of a number between 1 and 10. Like, how are you? And then I also invite you, one of the really important aspects of any conversation where we want to explore possible painful stories and also the process of healing is just to remember we always have options. So you know where the mute button is. You can mute at any time if the conversation is not what you need right now. And if whatever you have around you to kind of, if whatever helps you ground, I have my little, I'm like a hot drink person. It's just how I feel settled in. So I have my cup of tea here, but whatever that is for you, I invite you to have it handy. So I opted not to share my screen today. I think I value being able to see you all. And that becomes more difficult when I share my screen. And so if there are any websites or quotes that you need, you're welcome to contact me and I can send you that material, but I'm going to simply talk here. And I probably will not present for a whole hour. I'm really interested in our conversation after, but I'll see how it goes. So I want to start out by saying that there is a certain behavior that many of us today go to when we feel scared. And this behavior that many human beings go to when we feel scared is that we draw lines and we pour energy into what I like to call something like being gatekeepers of belonging. So for instance, deciding who's in, who's out, carrying out behaviors that ensure or even sort of demonstrate or prove that we are in. And at the same time as we're doing that, we also kind of keep our ears and our eyes attuned to potential threats. Yes, Chris, you're citing one of my favorite poems. We should cite the whole thing at the end to bring us back around. So as we get started, I would like us to actually take a moment and just pause right now with me, if you will, and reflect about or bring to mind an example of this phenomenon, of this experience of looking for clear boundaries and expressing behavior to make sure that you're in and that you're clear on who's out as a way of feeling safe in the face of uncertainty or fear. This is very common human behavior. So I want us to have an example in mind. So maybe perhaps bring to mind the first time that you remember in your life, sort of noticing that you were, behaving in that way, carrying out some sort of gatekeeper role, finding your belonging in shutting out or judging someone else. Or maybe if that's a bit too close to home, maybe just bring to mind an example of this that you've run across in a book, in a movie, something that has stuck with you over the years. Yeah, the example of thinking of the Adventist community as we're not like those people. Yeah, and that's an interesting, Lauren, you bring up an interesting point there, because I've been kind of collecting stories of people's experiences of purity culture. And one that stood out to me recently was a woman who said she was basically trained to be at war with herself, continual war with herself. And that is an exhausting, state.
I talked to a woman last night who said to me, chatted to her, said to me, I've spent my whole life humiliating myself. And I said, what do you mean? She said, I never gave myself the permission to be imperfect. All I remembered was all the bad things that I did or the ways that I failed. And I really have come to believe that there are a lot of people who there are some people who always blame outward, but there are a lot of people who uh, take it inwardly, and
Yeah.
that was her story. I thought it was a very profound way of saying it.
And there may always be like a bit of, I don't know, a bit of both and, because I'm thinking the earliest example that comes to my mind is being in the back seat of the van of a family that we were friends with, you know, who had a couple adolescent kids around my age. And yeah, I remember the hearing myself blurt out something. I grew up in a very our whole identity was based around health food particularly. So I was saying something about like how disgusting it was that people would eat Doritos, right? Because it's ruining your health and you're not taking seriously that you're made in the image of God and you're a God's temple. And I was saying all of this, and I looking back, like in that moment, I had a realization after the words came out of my mouth that I had just expanded the gulf, right? I had just muddied the human to human connection there in the back of the van between me and the other people. But I can look back now and also see that I was doing that in order to prove that I belonged, right? Because if belonging comes from proving that you eat perfect food, then I need to prove that as often as possible, right? So that both and like the wanting to prove and also we're pushing people away. We're actually undoing belonging in the process. That tension is something I think worth reflecting on. But with whatever examples come to your mind, there are so many. Like I said, this act of kind of drawing lines and carrying out behavior that kind of proves that we somehow belong, even if it means pointing out that others do not belong. This is such a common way of making sense of the experience of uncertainty and the fear that brings in our human experience. And this morning, I'm going to be exploring purity culture. I think there's probably no single way to define this. It represents a huge array of different thinking. There are threads in it, but I'm particularly wanting to look at it this morning as a phenomenon that created where the boundary lines could be in all different places, but where what was being decided as people negotiated this question of in or out was whether someone could be with God. So whatever purity life choices someone might have made, or whatever culture, one of these sub cultures, I'm interested in exploring how this phenomenon of making the line and then deciding who's in and out and how that relates to belonging played out in purity culture. So I will spend some time. Actually, I want to copy paste into the chat right now. Let me see if I can find it. A website that I think has, I mean, there are lots of definitions that has this one has a relatively good brief summary. So I will paste this in the chat, and then I will read one other definition, which is from a book called Church 2. And this is I think one of the best easy to read books engaging with the topic of I mean, this author makes very direct claims that some of the aspects of the teachings in the realm of purity culture have been what have created a framework for abuse to be upheld within a lot of Christian contexts. And you'll hear that in her definition. This is Emily Joy Allison, and she says purity culture is the spiritual corollary of rape culture, created in Christian environments by theologies that teach complete sexual abstinence until legal monogamous marriage between a cisgender heterosexual man and a cisgender heterosexual woman for life, or else. And so she talks about how no matter what the details are of some of the examples that I'm going to give later, that this idea of this image or else, and how nothing else can be part of a Christian life and experience, alienates a lot of people and also causes space for us to harm each other without accountability. But going back to the main question that I'm interested in looking at, I'm going to give examples from purity culture, and I'm going to specifically draw on examples that I was exposed to in my background. But my primary goal throughout all of this is really for us to reflect on a larger question, and that is, how do we think of and experience the presence of God? And what impact does this have on how we engage with ourselves, with other people, and with the world that we inhabit? So to start out exploring this, I guess I want to pick apart this phrase, purity culture, because there are so many different ways people talk about culture. And I think today I'm talking about it in two particular ways. One is just the idea that a group of people can have sort of a way of life, right? Where we have internalized, often without thinking about it, a set of behaviors, beliefs, values, and symbols, and the group overall accepts these, okay? That's why we may not always be aware of this until something happens to make us pause and look at it more consciously. And then another element of what is culture that I think is relevant here is this whole idea of finding some sense of safety in defining who's in and who's out. So one way to say this is that culture can be a collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the members of one group or category of people from another. And I choose this because a lot of the research that's been done looking back on the development of what we would call purity culture really shows that there was intentional planning to create a environment where people didn't actually know there were options. And I'll just give a couple of examples. One example from my own growing up is that we got all of our reading material from a very few narrow set of publishing houses, and therefore there was no awareness that there were alternate ways to look at things. And so that is part of this, right? This collective programming. And then there are people like Kristen Kobes-Dumais and others who are researching sort of the bigger picture of the development of these ideas over, I would say, the last 50 years. And some of them will show how even there used to be, for instance, Christian bookstores, all over, independently owned, separate, and each one was making decisions about what would be placed on the shelves based on the needs and interests of their immediate communities. And there was a concerted effort to combine all of that. And so when I was growing up, Christian Book Distributors catalog would come in the mail, right? And most everything that I ever read was out of that book. I see this play out. Interestingly, we have in my department here at Walla Walla University, we have a theology book sale, which is often the books that we're selling each year. Once a year, we have this. We set up all these tables, and often the books that we're selling are collections from pastors who have retired and no longer need their books. And it has struck me that over the past 20 years, there's a certain set of books that every single pastor who's retiring has, and then deposits here on this table for us then to pass on for 25 cents to our students. And so these are some of the things that I mean, that there creates this bubble where there's no alternative way of looking at things. And so if we think about culture as a way of life of a group of people, where you can see it in the behaviors, beliefs, values, and symbols, and that they're not all consciously taken on, then also just be aware that sometimes there is intentional effort to collectively program groups of people, I would say, in order to control them. And there's a comment in the chat that kind of alluded to this, that there's an interaction between tenets of purity culture and headship theology, for instance. James Dobson will directly say this if you look back on his work as he moved out of the American Psychological Association and founded Focus on the Family and started trying to create order in the midst of chaos. And the way to do that was to return to a structured family life, right? To dare to discipline your children, to have a clear hierarchy of who was in charge. And so these messages really are deeply intertwined. So another reason when talking about culture to name the fact that there's a collective programming is just to recognize that even though we might say people have a choice, when you're within these systems, they are designed to control people in mass. And so that's something for us to be aware of. And then I think it's interesting. I'm gonna just say one or two elements of what is purity. You know, if we're taking this phrase apart, purity and culture, what is purity? And I want to come back to this toward the end, but basically, if you Google, like I Googled purity, right? And I just looked through all the definitions that come up, and there's a variety of ways it's worded, but you could say purity is being undiluted or unmixed with extraneous material. For instance, there's a line in the book of Exodus where the people see God, and he's walking on sapphire. And it's as clear, right? That clearness, it's as clear. That clearness is described with the Hebrew word for pure. I grew up down the road from someone who made their living mining gold. So if you've ever seen that process unfold, you know that any elements that get burned out of there, right? What you have then is just the gold. That's what happens when you put the powder or whatever they throw into the molten metal that gets out the things that are not gold. So this idea of purity as undiluted, unmixed with extraneous material, another definition said the condition or quality of being pure. So freedom from anything that debases, contaminates, pollutes, etc. Or the state of not being mixed with anything else. So however we look at it, that this idea of purity as being like whole, I want to say, let's think of purity as being whole and unsullied by things that don't belong, okay? And I'll come back to this. What happens in purity culture, especially with movements like True Love Waits or the Silver Ring thing, or the whole slew of literature that I grew up with, for instance, Passion and Purity by Elizabeth Elliot and I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris. What these books do is they create a space in which adolescents are constantly hypervigilant about the point at which a person or relationship goes from being pure to impure. Okay, and this hypervigilance, like it's the hypervigilance that I want to pay attention to, and how this relates to a sense of connection to the presence of God, because how exactly it plays out, the exact lines can be different, but the same phenomenon is happening. So let me just give you a couple of examples. I grew up with multiple messages. So I had the message growing up. Well, I'll go back to that. I want to start with the James Dobson material. There was a James Dobson sort of teaching that I was given in my high school Bible class. And in that class, we were presented with an image of a ladder, like a step ladder. And the ladder, I now know, it's called a ladder of intimacy. And it's based on the work of a zoologist who's named Desmond Morris. And the book that this is from is entitled Intimate Behavior, a Zoologist's Classic Study of Human Intimacy. And Morris, he studies all kinds of animals, but he wrote this book about human animals. And he says all animal courtship patterns are organized in a typical sequence. And the course taken by a human love affair is no exception. And then he goes on to outline 12 stages of intimacy. So just to give you a sense of how he outlines this, he says stage 1 is eye to body. Stage 2, eye to eye. Stage 3, voice to voice. Stage 4, hand to hand. Stage 5, arm to shoulder. Stage 6, arm to waist. Stage 7, mouth to mouth. Stage 8, hand to head. I think I got my numbering off, so I'm just going to read the rest. Next is hand to body, then mouth to breast, then hand to genitals, and then genitals to genitals. So James Dobson essentially took this list that is created by a zoologist observing behavior, and he created this kind of, shall we say, yeah, like a ladder, a hierarchy, kind of stages. And the zoologist is very clear that these are drastic oversimplifications. Okay, so the zoologist is not trying to say this is a rigid thing in any sense, but this is what was given to me in high school Bible class from James Dobson, that there's these stages. And for James Dobson, in most of what I've seen from him, everybody has this line, right? They have this line. Like I said, in purity culture, adolescents are told to constantly be hypervigilant about this line, where at what point does a person or relationship cross over from being pure to being impure? So for James Dobson, the line is right between the first 8 of these 12 stages of intimacy can happen before people are married, okay? But the last 4, so when you get to hand to body, mouth to breast, etc. Notice also this is so blatantly male-centered, but that's a side note. For him, that was the line. And so if you were to cross that line before you were married, then that would be what would, make you cross over from pure to impure. Now, for me, what happened was a really complicating mixing of messages. So I had this ladder provided to me in high school Bible class, and the idea was twofold. One was that, like, what the zoologist says is that generally speaking, if good, strong bonds are formed, this process unfolds slowly, okay, and over a period of time, and that allows a kind of bond to form. And so the way that's not how the message landed for me. What I heard was, watch out, because you as a woman are going to bond emotionally way up here at the top, like hand to hand, right there. You as a woman are going to bond emotionally, but the guy that you're with is going to have no emotional connection at all until you get to the end. So that was one of the messages. And the other message was that these stages that have been, put together by observation are not so much something that is a natural, slow progression as we cultivate intimacy with one another, but they were presented to me like a slip and slide. So you know how when a kid is playing on a slip and slide, often you let them start with like a little bit less of a slope. That's where you like put the soap and you have the hose over the piece of plastic. And then once they can get started, then, it can really drop off and they go sailing off. Well, this is how this was presented to me, that these stages of intimacy were really a scary thing. First of all, because me as a woman would attach emotionally early on, and there was no possibility of the guy at doing that. And second of all, because that once you get on this slippery slope, then it's all over. So taking that, the messaging that was connected with the James Dobson presentation of the ladder of intimacy, And then combining that with my homeschool curriculum, which included all kinds of messaging that good Christian people didn't date. They didn't kiss. They never went out with anyone of the opposite sex unless in large groups and with the favor of all the men in the community. Okay. So when you combine this gets complicated, because I'm saying it doesn't matter as much where someone draws this line, but the idea that there's a rigid line, right? I don't care where you're drawing it, but the idea that there's a rigid line after which you've gone over the edge, right? You've passed you're on the slippery slope. There's no going back, etc. This, you've crossed from pure to impure. The idea that there's a rigid line causes all kinds of problems, especially when crossing over that line is equated with losing access to the presence of God. Okay, with proving that you are now no longer. And this idea, when I use the phrase losing access, I mean, I'm thinking in terms of how if you think of the sanctuary in the Hebrew Bible, and how there's certain ways that people would be able to access, right? There's certain rules around access to the presence of God. And that idea that there are certain rules around access to the presence of God, that gets mapped on to these teachings where people decide, okay, and listen to what I'm saying, people decide where this line is drawn. And then that becomes mapped on to, can you or can you not access the presence of God? And here, I think it may be helpful. I have so many books open on my desk right now because there are just examples of this all over. But I think I want to cite. I want to cite something out of, this is a book called Unclean. It's not a new book. It came out years and years ago, but it's a book where Richard Beck unpacks kind of how the purity metaphor is used in the area of sexuality and not in the area of other kinds of sins, even though people in the church often say, like, we don't make a difference between different kinds of sins. They're all equal before God, et cetera, et cetera. So Beck explains this idea of presence of God, and then what I'm saying, where we map on this idea of the sanctuary. God lives in the sanctuary, and you can only access it if you're quote unquote pure. Beck explains this, and he says, most sin categories are structured by metaphors that entail rehabilitation. In other words, they draw forth from us a sense of, oh, I have harmed someone. There's something that I want to make right? And we can easily move into that work of repair. But he says, purity metaphors have no such entailment. Recall that contamination judgments are governed by the attribution of permanence, right? Once there's a fly in the soup, the pot is ruined. Consequently, when sins are structured by purity metaphors, there is no obvious route to repentance. The metaphor only entails permanent defilement and ruin, okay? The feeling of a loss that can never be recovered. So think about what he's saying about purity metaphors. And yeah, Chris, this is a great example, right? What they did at so many of these purity events for teenagers was pass around chewed up gum and tell all the girls that if they didn't stick to whatever the line was, right? In every community, the line was in a different place, but wherever the line was, if they crossed it, they would be like chewed gum. No way to go back. And so if then being in a state of purity, right, is the only way that you can have access to the presence of God, then this is really setting the foundation for tremendous pain, especially for conscientious adolescents who want with all their hearts nothing more than to serve God with all their heart, soul, and mind. One way that I have or one quote that has helped me to reflect on this is, there's a woman named Susan David who talks about emotional agility is her research specialty. And she says that rigidity in the face of complexity is toxic. Okay, and I think I will try to say a couple of words about this, what I mean by this complexity. So one example of where people encounter this complexity could be a teenager who has read only books where you date in big groups a man that your dad has chosen as great potential marriage material, even if you're only 17. And then you end up wanting to go out with a boy that has no interest in this conservative subculture of evangelical homeschool cult, Christianity, and just wants to date and just wants to experiment with having relationships, which is totally normal in adolescence. Then what you're left with is the question of, wait, he must not be with God, because I'm with God because I am going to go to the altar without having kissed anyone. But this boy who just wants to date normal and not call it courtship and wants to hang out without my dad around must not be with God. And so you run into situations where normal adolescent development is labeled as inherently bad and is then mapped onto the idea that if you do it, you are actually soiling your potential for connection with God permanently. Okay. Now, another example of how this plays out, again, I'm talking specifically of the rigidity in the face of complexity being toxic, is the unreasonable expectations that are set up for marriage. Okay, and I could give all kinds of examples to illustrate this point, but I will simply quote out of an article that I recently read called Don't Act Now, Selling Christian Abstinence in the Religious Marketplace. This is by Sarah Moslaner. And she's quoting someone who is working with the True Love Waits campaign. And they say, okay, abstaining from sexual activity before marriage is God's design for your sexual life. Embrace God's intention and you will be blessed relationally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Reject God's plan, and notice here, what's meant by God's plan has nothing to do with God, okay? It's a person's decision of where the line is between pure and impure. But it says reject God's plan and you will be sentenced to a future of bitter memories, emotional turmoil, disease, unwanted pregnancy, and separation from God. So imagine what this does if someone, really pours their whole heart into waiting and being hyper vigilant about keeping that line and pouring all of their effort into investing in this maintenance of purity, and then they get married, and rather than feeling amazingly blessed relationally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, they have the experience of the other half of this, right? Bitter memories, emotional turmoil, disease, unwanted pregnancy, and a sense of separation from God. Okay, so we set people up to have expectations, and this in way, I think one way to think about this is, let me see if I can find this example. There's a phenomenon that I think most thoughtful Christians would say that they reject if you were to ask them directly. And that is what we call the prosperity gospel. So many religious leaders, even in conservative evangelical circles, if you really ask them, will say, no, we reject this. The Bible has a more nuanced view. It's not as simple as saying, if you do this and this, God will do this and this for you, etc. But what Caitlin Beatty points out is she uses the term sexual prosperity gospel. And she says, basically, this is her kind of summary. She says it holds out that God will reward premarital chastity with a good Christian spouse, great sex, and perpetual marital fulfillment. Okay. And so she talks about how many people who would explicitly and do explicitly reject the prosperity gospel still accept the sexual prosperity gospel. Okay. And she also talks about people who have sort of, made this popular, are people who said, okay, we have to find a way to talk about sexual abstinence in a way that will be attractive to all of these teenagers that we're talking to. And they're concerned about coming across as, I don't know, boring or prudish, etc. And so they started to put forward a narrative that basically said that you as a Christian young person are set apart. You are the special minority that's like better than the rest of the population. And what sets you apart is this particular single brand of life. And they held it up, she says, as the ultimate one-up to secular licentiousness. God wants to give you a hot spouse and a great sex life as long as you wait. And so there was this image that if you, and I'll give you another example. One element of a lot of these groups that went around the US and even around the world campaigning, I might add, it was supported by government funding all the way back from the 80s. There's a tremendous amount of government funding that went to these sex education programs that were put on by churches. And one of the things that I saw that was listed in one of the performances is like a young married man who would stand up and do this with his wedding ring and say, this is your ticket to unlimited sex all day, every day. So the idea that all of these these teenagers with hormones shooting through their body, if they can just rigidly stick to whatever formula their community like advocated for, then suddenly the instant that they went to the altar, they would have, this perfect emotional, physical, and sexual intimacy and a deep sense of the favor of God. And I probably don't need to tell you that set a lot of people up for tremendous disillusionment. So she also points out when she's talking, Caitlin Beatty, about this what she calls the sexual prosperity gospel, is she points out that many times the illusion of control in an unpredictable world is what these narratives offer us. And she says that we are most tempted to adopt prosperity teachings for our greatest areas of vulnerability. And to support her point, she notes that the population that is often most attracted to the broader prosperity gospel, where you're promised wealth, is people who are facing poverty and financial insecurity. And she said, there's nothing like these purity culture messages to speak to a whole stadium full of adolescents who are sexually frustrated. So this illusion of control, we're attracted to it, right? Most often easily drawn into it in areas of existing vulnerability. And so the last thing that maybe I will talk all the way till 11:30. Look at that. the last thing that I want to note here, and I'm not sure which thing to quote. So maybe I'll quote one line from someone, and then I'll try to explain it, because it's come up over and over in pretty much every book and article that I've read about this. A woman named Amy Dennison, who wrote about her experience growing up with this purity culture messaging. She's talking specifically about kind of the whole, someone mentioned it here, this phenomenon of like purity balls, where you dance with your dad and you're given your very first actual like valuable piece of jewelry, so often with a jewel in it, and it's expensive and needs care, and it would be given at this kind of special ceremony, and it was a commitment of the parents to help protect the daughter's purity, and then it was a commitment of the daughter to protect her own purity. But Dennison says that Christians overall are used to the idea of like physically marking commitment and belonging. So think in terms of, we take the Eucharist, we have baptism, plenty of these rituals that allow us to show physically our sign of internal commitment. And so Dennison says that physically marking the body with an outward sign to announce an internal commitment was foundational to born-again Christian identity. And so for people who partook of these ceremonies where they are, they're signing and they're reading aloud a purity pledge, and then they're putting on a purity ring, she says, for believers who desire to first and foremost love God, the pledge and ring was holy PDA. Okay, and so this idea of, I don't know how else to say it, but to say that an intentional element of these movements as they were developed and as they sought to capture the imagination of entire generations of American young people, was an equating of the commitment to whatever brand of purity that particular organization or group was espousing, equating that with one's commitment to God, making it into a foundational tenet of their Christian faith. Just like we would say, you know how people argue about, well, what exactly do you believe about the resurrection of Jesus? Or did you say the correct version of the sinner's prayer? That, we have these things within various communities that help us decide who's a real Christian and who's not. And that same phenomenon plays out in purity culture. And it becomes, and one of the elements, going back to the use of the Christian marketplace, is that they published hundreds of thousands of Bibles that are topical. So this is a huge marketing thing. But they published hundreds of thousands of these, and one of them was called the Abstinence Bible, and another was called True Love Waits, and they would come included with little study Bible insets about how to clean your purity ring and what to do if you slipped sexually after you had signed the pledge, and all of these things. And one of the things that was put into these insets and articles and preface pages in the purity Bibles was this messaging that equated one's commitment to Christ with their purity or abstinence pledge. And so this again feeds into what I'm saying, that it becomes equated with salvation, with access to the presence of God, with holiness, and because it's so deeply tied to the natural, always there need of humans to belong, it's deeply it impacts us on such a deep level, because we desperately want to belong and we want to be with God. So that equating becomes then a source of pain for when we face these disillusioning moments in our lives and we realize there was a flaw in the messaging, right? That the rigidity of that messaging and the complexity of life don't add up. And we experience, what Susan David talks about as being toxic because of however that lands for us. There are a couple of quotes that I would like to bring us around to. One is one woman wrote that as a new generation of Christians work out a sexual ethic in the wake of purity culture, it is worth recalling that formulas cannot shield us from the pain, frailty, and disappointment of being human. And when I read that, and then later on she says, it is we, not God. So it's not God, she says, it's us who come up with the formulas. If you do this, then God will do this for you. And it strikes me when I was reading her description that the same way that we take the if-then descriptions from the book of Deuteronomy, for instance, in the Hebrew Bible, and for instance, if you obey God, God will make every aspect of your life fertile. So in Deuteronomy, it's described as your women will be fertile, your cattle will be fertile, your sheep and goats will be fertile, your wheat fields will make wheat, your grapevines will produce grapes. Every aspect from humans to animals to agriculture, if you obey God, there will be fertility. And then the reverse is also in the summaries in Deuteronomy. You have the reverse also. If you don't listen to God, then every aspect of life is going to be infertile and you are going to experience what is called futility, right? Where you work for the grapevines, but then you don't get to eat the fruit. You build the house, you don't get to live in it. You experience this continual conflict and lack of safety. And so it's easy for us as humans to take some of these overarching kind of frameworks and actually go beyond what it says. So it's one thing to say, generally speaking, these habits, right? Like one of the things that always cracks me up in Deuteronomy is it says, if you go around removing your neighbor's boundary stones, if you go around removing the stakes that mark off where the property line is, you're going to be cursed. Well, yeah, of course you are, because that ticks people off. Like you can't just go and move the boundary line to make your property bigger and your neighbor's smaller. It's going to have consequences. So in a way, some of that whole idea of blessing and curses, right? If you live according to these general principles, life is going to go better for you than if you live according to these. That's all fine and good until we infer backwards from an outcome. And then we try to say something about someone's relationship with God. Okay. So if I believe, for instance, that if you're pure and you listen to God in regard to purity, then God is going to give you an amazing sex life once you're married. Well, then if you get married and all kinds of things bring this up, okay? Some men expect there to be blood, which there may or may not be, okay? And some people experience vaginismus and other things that make it impossible to even have vaginal intercourse for months or even years after marriage. Then the danger becomes inferring from that, oh, I wonder what they did. They must have done something. And so this point that she's making where she says it is we who come up with the formulas, right? And these formulas cannot shield us from the pain, frailty, and disappointment of being human in a broken world. This is something so important for us to think about. So I want to finish just by saying that it's ironic that many of the proponents of purity culture and the various messaging that falls under that big umbrella, probably if you asked them, they would say what they want is the best for their children, for the people in their community. And they want to protect people, etc. But ironically, if we go back to the meaning of the word purity, is to be like whole, right? With everything that belongs there, and then things that don't belong being out. And what purity culture has actually done is arrested natural development. So in times in our lives when we naturally should have been developing emotionally, or learning about nuance, or to hold space for paradox, or to navigate increasing levels of complexity with wisdom and discernment, we were actually like buckling down into a state of rigidity that stopped our development. And that makes it actually harder as we go through life to experience like this sense of purity, right? That everything is there. We're whole people. And sexuality is part of every aspect of our lives, our culture, our psychology, our way of navigating relationships, our work. We split things off rather than cultivating that bringing together a sense of wholeness. So coming back around to what I started with, I started by saying that when we feel scared, we as humans often go automatically to making a line, deciding who's in and who's out, and to policing that line in some way to prove our own sense of belonging. And I want to close by reading a quote that I have been turning over and over in my head the last year or so since I first read it. It's from Susan Cain's book, Bittersweet: How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole. And she says that the secret our poets and philosophers have been trying to tell us for centuries is that our longing is the great gateway to belonging. So I guess my question is for us as we move into a discussion period is how might we validate every person's longings, and how might we create space for complexity that's part of human life, and how might we grow in our awareness of how the messaging that we've received, whatever that was, about sexuality and who was in and who was out and where the lines were and who got to decide where the lines were, like a greater awareness of how that messaging has impacted how we engage with ourselves, with other people, and with the world in which we live.